Let me start with kind of a formal thing. It has been coming up this morning. So this right there is a star. As any software engineer knows, it's a wildcard character. This is not what you think it says, okay? Anyway, so into the talk. Good afternoon. My name is Yorgos, and I'm a software engineer at Red Hat. Who else is a software engineer? And who's a product owner or a scrum master or something else? Oh, right. Okay. Well, this talk is actually about everyone, because today's talk is about what I think is one of the most important trends that can shape society throughout the world in the 21st century. It's not just about software engineers, it's not just about product owners, it's about everyone. And the reason I chose this topic is because we talk a lot about distributed systems, and with all the shift that's happening in, this cloud world and everything moving into microservices and everything, there's a lot of talk about distributed systems. There's a lot of talk about the technical side. And there's not enough talk about the other side of the problem. You see, I say this is an easy problem because when you know enough about a technical system, when you know enough about its current state and its input and what goes in and out, it's fairly easy to deterministically predict the output, how it's going to react. That's a problem when we talk about people. If we talk about people problems, that's hard. Trying to predict how others are going to respond depending on the input and output. And that's why I think we should be focusing on distributed companies and not just the distributed systems. Let me talk to you a little bit about what has brought me to talk to you here about this. So I was born and raised in a very, beautiful, sunny, amazing part of the world, which is the paradise island of Crete. If you haven't been, you should go. There I've done my part as a proud Cretan. And I went to study in a place where I could get, better education and access to really good jobs. But that place, the UK, was very cold, it was very cloudy, it was grey, it was rainy, and, having grown up in Crete, it's something you miss. So I've always been wondering, how can I get the best of these, both worlds? Good quality of life, nice place to live, and also at the same time having a good job and, working for a company where you really enjoy what you want to do. So now I work remotely and I can do that. I work for Red Hat, which I'm sure you all know as the world's open source leader. And that has been making some pretty interesting headlines recently. I won't talk about that now. I'm on the team for 3Scale. 3Scale is an API management project. And I can basically talk to you about it without selling it to you, because that's the beauty of open source. You can just, go grab it, use it for free. So it's part of Red Hat's middleware, and you can basically think of this as something you put in front of your API, and it handles your traffic control and access authorization, things like rate limiting, throttling, things like that. And if you have any plans that you want to put in front on different API endpoints. So Red Hat is this really big organization with more than 12,000 employees, close to 100 offices, nearly 40 countries, really big place. And a lot of people there are working remotely, about 25%, apparently, the stats say. An even larger number than that is working from home multiple days a week. So it's very, very typical to have this, kind of distributed teams working together. A lot of it is focused around remote working. It's not a remote first or remote only company, but it's on the way there. And when we talk about this, remote working, and I say this to the people in my neighborhood who see me, and I'm always at home and I'm working, and it's strange, right? It's hard for them to understand that you can work in a place where you don't have a manager that's looking over your shoulder, and there is no physical way for somebody to keep track of whether you're working or whether you're not. Right? That challenges the traditional, mental model we have about work in general. I've even been told it sounds like a scam, right? This was some distant family, right? Are you sure you're going to get paid? Yeah. So it sounds like it shouldn't work. But the reason it works, and the reason it works so well, especially for Red Hat, is because it's based on another model that also sounds like it shouldn't work. And that's the model of, interference issues. The model of open source. Any contributors to open source projects? Yeah, lots of people, more than 3 projects, more than 5. Yeah, well, so a lot of people have, this experience with open source, so some of this should make sense. So, but, through the years we've been hearing that open source shouldn't work, right? There was this big war between, closed source companies and open source shouldn't work. Because open source is based on a social model which it goes completely against the capitalist, allow me to say, society that we live in today. It's based on this notion that you create something and you give it out to everyone to use for free. It's a gift, right? You give it out and without necessarily getting something in return. So it shouldn't work. But then the last 50 years of open source history, because that's how much we have behind us, have come to show us that, yes, it does work and it's here to stay. And one of the reasons why it shouldn't work is this voluntary work idea, that people can, put work for free because they want to do that. And when you look at the dictionary for this kind of thing, here is what you get if you look up work, right? So work is basically something that you get paid to do. It requires sustained effort, and you either do it because you have to, or somebody makes you do it. And open source is none of that. So people, what they do is they spend their free time kind of working like this, right? For a lot of people, this doesn't make sense. And to put this into perspective, right, to show you what really is going on here, people they have the option to go home and to pick up their PlayStation controller, right, and spend their afternoons and evenings entertaining themselves. But instead, what they do is they go and pick up their keyboards and they continue to do work. And this is something that they like. This is something that we like. If you look at the Stack Overflow developer survey for this year, there are 100,000 people who have filled this in, right? So we're not talking about a small sample. And coding as a hobby, 80% says that they take coding as a hobby. And I have to tell you, my good friends, that that is not normal. There aren't a lot of professions where you would see 80%, finishing work and then continuing to do the same thing as their hobby. Sometimes I think we almost need an intervention as a profession. So if we think about, where does work start and where it stops, it's kind of hard to draw this line in between, right? We all agree that these guys are having fun and this guy is working, but I could probably swap these pictures around and it would still kind of make sense, right? Because this guy could be concentrating to solve a difficult problem. That's something we like to do. So if you're coding for work and you're coding for fun, what's the difference? The important thing we can draw out of that is that the profound thing, I think, is that there is some intrinsic motivation for software engineers, which basically means intrinsic motivation, we are self-driven. And that's why it works without managers. We already want to be doing this job, and it's just a matter of somebody pointing us, giving us what we need to get into the right direction. It's almost a bottom-up approach, because in open source, you can choose the kind of work that you want to do and start doing it, and nobody has to tell you to do it. It doesn't come from the top, it comes from the bottom up. So the other reason open source shouldn't work was because, scaling people is a problem, but then you look at some stats from GitHub, and if you check the numbers in these, some of the most popular projects, we're not talking about, getting a few hundreds of people working together. We're talking about thousands and basically tens of thousands of people working together in the same projects. If we look at the Linux kernel, the most popular open source project, again, over 15,000 contributors. But do note this, 1,400 companies are paying their employees, right, to produce code that they then will give out free. There's a big shift happening. And remote working is very much related to that. So, still, people were skeptical, right? They said, open source will never catch on. And I want you to look at this now, because 6 months ago, when I gave this talk, I used this slide. And I said that, it already has, because we have so many public repos, active repos, 25 million active repos since September 2016, this says. 1 billion public commits. But that was back in May. And since then, we had this. We had Microsoft paying $7.5 billion to buy GitHub, the biggest open source repository. And we also had this, which wasn't given enough attention. Microsoft, like the bad Microsoft that we all knew, right? That was fighting open source to sell, Windows and win those government contracts and so on. They gave away all their patents for free. And as if that wasn't enough, then this happened. The biggest software acquisition in history, and it was an open source company. 34. Is that related to this? The biggest software acquisition in history for 34 billion. Does it really matter when we get to those figures? But is there really any question about where we're going? My friends, everybody who put your hands up because you've contributed to an open source project, I have to say, open source has won. So take a moment to rejoice and think about that. And the reason I think it has won is because it has this potential to outscale the closed source model of development. By outscale, I mean that it can tap into any geography in the world. Right? These are the accounts in GitHub, so you can see, it's basically from any part of the world. You still have people contributing to open source projects across time zones, embracing, this model of asynchronous communication. And if you look closely on GitHub, and I don't know if you've noticed, but there's no direct messaging built in to a platform that's built for collaboration, right? For teams collaboration over source code. What it does support really well is this model of, having on-topic discussions about, some particular topic, whether it's an issue or a pull request or inline comments on the source code. It supports really well this notion of asynchronous communication on a specific topic or thread. So even with open source, this asynchronous communication is the main way that communication happens. And this pattern is not new. Asynchronous communication is what we had back in, a few years ago with forums and mailing lists, right? It's the same established pattern of communication. And if we go even further back, or maybe not so far back, but we had snail mail. Snail mail is another, asynchronous communication. And people were still doing business across, countries, cities, just based on snail mail. Asynchronous communication is an established pattern, and it works. And I think that's also one of the reasons why Slack works. So instead of going for who uses Slack, who doesn't use Slack? Yeah, goes to show you. So, because Slack has managed to support this model of, switching between asynchronous, which is the main type of communication, and synchronous when you need to, it has managed to support this really well. And I emphasize on asynchronous communication so much because it's one of the main foundations of remote working as we now begin to dive into it a bit more. So let's, considering some key facts about, the world and the industry today. First up, there's a huge demand for software developers. If you don't know this, you're probably living under a rock. And you just have to walk outside and talk to the recruiters out there. At the same time, there are big differences in the economies of different countries, right? We all know how much outsourcing has played a big role in the previous years. But at the same time, people would rather stay close, to where they grew up, to their friends and family, or maybe just a nicer place in the world without, this cloudy grey London is looming over me. So going back to, examine each of these points in more detail. First up, we have the demand. This huge demand about software developers. Back to the Stack Overflow survey, again, 95,000 responses, and only 6% is not employed. 6% of software developers, and this is not, this is not the US. This is 100,000 people around the world in countries where unemployment is much larger than that. And just look at Greece. Have we had, even during the crisis, did we have much of a problem as software engineers? Yes, things got worse, but compared to other industries. And if you look at the figures and the salaries, going into the US now, what this says is that, and you can look it up in more detail later, but what this says is the starting salary kind of averaged throughout all the states and for big cities in the US, is about, it ranges from 90,000 to 150 as a starting salary as a software engineer in the US. So keep those figures in mind, because they're going to come up again as we go and look at what happens in the rest of the world. Here we look at the different economies of the countries, and basically dark blue are the really advanced economies. And here, yes, Greece is dark blue, but just keep in your minds how much of the world is dark blue. If you look at this whole picture, it's not that much. And if we try to put some numbers on this, so the gross domestic product, dark green is over $50,000, and you can see the dark green, parts of the world. So again, a very small part of the world. Light green is 10 to 20. So what this explains, in kind of from a bird's eye view, is why outsourcing even existed and exists. Because these days, with these kinds of differences and with these high salaries that there are in the US and the other advanced markets, it makes sense for companies to hire both more people at a lower cost and also get access to better people. That they don't have to, because they don't have to compete in the local markets with the other companies. All three things at the same time, at a lower cost. When they embrace remote working. On the other hand, the supply, right? We talk about this big demand. The supply, it looks like this. If you embrace remote working, you can hire from anywhere in the world, because smart people are born everywhere, regardless of color, skin color, regardless of religion, regardless, whatever other thing it is that keeps cultures apart. Smart people are everywhere. But whoever doesn't get this, they're in a company that has to invest in bringing people, attracting people to, these big cities, centers, or technology, hubs. And you have to invest in work visas, getting people relocation bonuses, moving their families with them, help them find accommodation probably. And at the end of it all, what you have to hope is that, in 6 months or 1 year down the line, not only are they, good for the position that you selected them for, which is, it's a problem in itself anyway, but you also have to hope that their families have adjusted and they're happy and they want to stay at the place, not just your company. I think there's a lot of waste in that process, and that explains why remote working is such a big trend. So the demand shapes the world. People flock to these cities, and what you see happen is that they go there and they pull, in a sense, they pull money out of these economies, and then they can support, they can better support their families back home. And that's why that's what I mean when I talk about changing society, because this kind of flow of money back to the kind of poorer places in the world, that's what I think remote working enables. That's the kind of change you can bring. And I think we're in a good place where it can happen today more so than it has in the past, because we have a much bigger online presence. We have, come on, every time I use this. We have our social media profiles online. Whether that's a good thing or not, let's leave it for, discussion later. But we have them there. It's public information, basically. Anybody can look it up. We have our CVs. We have our portfolios, right? We have examples of our source code and our work. It's all, it's there if people want to look at it and judge us for our work and not just who we are. And we even have examples of how well we can communicate and how good we are with helping people, answering, questions. So if you put all of this together, it creates a much more complete picture about who this guy or girl is that's applying for your company. And I would argue, I would much rather prefer this kind of thing than a good-looking CV that drops in my hands. So assuming it's happening, it's all happening, and assuming you want to get involved, I want to talk first, a little bit about the pros and cons, and some things to keep in mind around remote working. So, first up, there is no commute. Does anybody like commuting? I spoke to somebody before who said he walks for 15 minutes to work, and that's, that was a nice commute. But when I'm talking about commute, I'm talking about this kind of commute. And remember, we're talking about big cities that attract, the majority of the people, which creates these kinds of problems, and these kinds of problems, or I think it's a problem. Because, not to mention these kinds of problems, delays and flat tires and, this idiot kind of cutting in through traffic and, ruining your day, and you find yourself shouting and, ruins your day before you even get to work. And it's 2 hours, I say there's an hour commute each way, it's 2 hours of your day that you're just wasting to get into and out of the office. I don't get that. And I walk my dog as part of my, that's what my commute is. I make a conscious effort to, walk my dog and then come back home, and, that's my commute into work. And sometimes, I kid you not, and this is not, I am so happy that I am not in this or this, that I want to dance. Like, I'm happy. I never have to think about, I never have to think a lot about what to wear. Okay, granted, we don't have, many companies with who, force people to wear suits anymore these days, or I hope it's a lessening trend. But all this effort that you put into, getting ready to go into work, you don't have to do that. You just focus on, wearing whatever it is that makes you comfortable and helps you be creative. That's what you want. And you don't have to worry if the other, guy or girl across the office is going to look at you funny because you wore a pink shirt, because you felt like it today. Don't stay in your pajamas, though. We're all comfortable in our pajamas, but there is, it is work, so you want to be able to separate that. I'll talk about that in a bit. So, I'm talking about choosing whatever it is that makes you creative. That also extends into your workplace. So, pick a place that you like, that makes you creative, that you don't have to put up with an open space office, you don't have to put up with, noisy colleagues, or people who just like it colder in the office, or, they need it to be warmer. So, it's just whatever you feel comfortable in. And then, you can find it, and you can change it, and then you can change it again. Can you do that in your office? The other thing is diversity. diversity is built in. So it's not something, that somebody comes along, a few years down the line and says, oh dear, it's all guys here, and all white males, how do we solve this? Diversity is built into this. It's not bolted on later. You'll find smart people who want to work on your project, and it's everyone. And it gives you a much more of a bird's eye view of the world. You can understand, it's not just this, we live in San Francisco, that's our market, that's what we understand as our environment around us. It's a big world, and having people in multiple countries gives you that, because you do have to think, about which people drink, which people don't, what people eat, and this kind of diversity opens up your mind. And that's what gives you the bird's eye view of the world. And you can leverage these local contacts for, when your team attends meetups or any other kind of technology event to get a feel of what is the developers out there in the world thinking. And it's no longer focused in your city. Or you can even leverage local contacts for research projects with universities. You have alumni from different schools in different countries. And you can travel. You go to a conference, you want to stay a couple of extra days and do some work and see the city where you're going, you can still continue working. It's not a problem. You're there. Meet the world. And there is this movement of digital nomads. If you're really into travel, do look into that, because those people take work wherever they go and just travel. And as a kind of a final parting tip, documentation is a bit of a chore, isn't it? We don't really like documenting things, but if you're part of a remote team where a lot of the communication is already written down, because it's in chats, because it's in shared documents that you use to align, because you don't have a whiteboard, it becomes much less of a chore. I won't go into too much detail about that, but it is kind of a benefit that comes sort of built in. And at the same time, there are some, pitfalls, some things you should watch out for, because I've heard it again and again that that remote working is not for everyone, and I tend to agree. But there are also, easy things you can fix to make your chances of success much higher. So first up, all the legal accounting stuff. If you are offered a job as a remote employee for some company, you do have to look at what that would mean. Are you a full-time employee? Would it require you to be self-employed? And what does that mean in your country in terms of taxes and accounting and whatnot? And I do have to say that it's not a solved problem. Not many companies can hire as a full-time employee someone in any country. So I think in most cases, becoming self-employed is the easy option. But there is a lot of activity in the kind of the remote workers community, and companies are stepping in to try to solve just the employment status problem. But yeah, just something to watch out for. Then you have to think about your workspace and equipment. So this means the space in your home, but also a desk and a chair. And because we do spend our days in chairs, invest in a good chair, or get out of the chair. even more important. So, but it's no longer, nobody imposes you to use whatever chair they have in the office. Pick a good one. It's about making your own choices and creating your own environment that allows you to be more productive. And then, of course, your gear. Does the company subsidize your laptop? What they do, what they don't. Can you pick your own laptop, or do you get whatever they give you? But the biggest roadblock, apart from these formalities, the biggest roadblock to remote working is this asynchronous communication, and I'm coming back to that because it does require you to change the way you work. What you have to make sure is that you never allow yourself to be blocked while you're waiting, for your work. Basically, you don't allow it to be blocked by waiting for input from somebody else. It's okay for one work item to be blocked, but you should make sure you have other things that you're working on so you can continue working on these things in parallel. Because you should expect, it's built in. It's going to be asynchronous. The other, teammate is going to respond to you maybe tomorrow, maybe in a few hours. What do you do for a few hours? That is something you have to keep in mind so you can. And yeah, if you think about it, if you've worked on concurrent programming, you should try to think about blocking and non-blocking I/O. And try to do the same thing with your work. But I do talk a lot about remote and not enough about face-to-face, and I do want to say that nothing replaces the bandwidth that you have in a face-to-face communication. This, two people in front of a whiteboard. So if you do find yourselves in a setting where you're never meeting with the rest of your team, yeah, that's probably a red flag. And you should aim for some regular meetings with your team so you can focus on social activities that help build relationships and then make your day-to-day jobs easier. Because when you see something written down, it's so easy to take it the wrong way if you don't know what it sounds like and what the person is really like. That part, I've found that you only get when you meet them in person. And then working from home, home is supposed to be this environment where we do not work. So, and I agree. So that's why it's important to think a lot about your work-life balance and try to be explicit about where work starts and when it stops. Because there should be a switch between that. Also think about where in the house you work. And then if you do find yourself in this setting, it's okay if it's a one-off, or if it only happens if your child is sick. But if this is your day-to-day, then this is a problem. You should be focusing more on creating a separate working space that somehow lies outside the house, and by that I mean your daily activities with your family don't necessarily include that space. Because it's your office. If you want to play with your kids, you have no reason to do that in your office. And it helps to have this explicit separation. It can be little things like, if you don't have enough space in your home, the very least you can do, when it's time to work, you put a tablecloth on the kitchen table, and you put your laptop and you begin working. But when you're finished, you close your laptop, you put it away, fold the tablecloth away. It's a small thing, But it changes this perception. It's clear now to everybody that walks into this same space, because you don't have enough. But it's clear that you're no longer working. It's safe to interrupt you. It's you're now part of the family again. You're not at work. If at all possible, the space you choose must have a door, and the door should have a lock. And you should explain to your kids that they're not allowed to come in and kind of interrupt you whenever they like, right? But as a friend once said, kids happen. So do keep in mind that kind of working at home is just one of the options for working remotely. And a lot of people, exactly because they can't create this environment at home, will go to a co-working space or a library or a cafe or whatever. So just one of the options. And as a final tip, do not take lightly the separation between a remote first and a remote friendly company. If you do find yourself as the only person who's working remotely, yeah, probably another red flag. And when you go for an interview, or when you have a video interview, do ask these questions. How do you communicate with the team? How does information flow to all the team members? How do you ensure remote team members are kept in the loop? These are, hard questions, but you have to ask them and expect for honest responses. And if they say we're remote friendly, we use Slack, maybe it's time to walk. So if you're kind of convinced, and I'll close off with this, you should know you're in good company. There are lots and lots of companies that are embracing remote working. So apart from Red Hat, there are, I'm sure you can recognize lots of big names there. What I do want to point out is this one down here, because this is an investment bank. And if investment banks are starting to be open about remote working, then maybe, you should reconsider as well. It's not as difficult as you think to convince your managers. So if you do want to find a remote job, you might want to take a snap of this. So these are some resources. These top sites have remote opportunities. These GitHub repos are about remote friendly and remote first companies. And I found that the Stack Overflow jobs it also offers a lot of remote opportunities as well. And then before you go and do it, before you quit your jobs and come chasing me because it didn't work out, do try some freelancing work first that you can do at home, something separate apart from your job, or even talk to your company and see if they're open to having you working from home a few days a week. Get some open source experience. It's going to help a lot in your in the application process. And if you want to find other people who are working remotely, it's a good bet that you'll find them in meetups. Because remember, these people are, probably working from home on their own, so they are looking for opportunities to socialize. Do go, do ask them, you'll find information that you can ask them yourselves. And with that, I'm done. I hope I've given you enough information to, start consider that maybe, just maybe your next job is going to be working remotely. Thanks a lot.